Let's scroll through this list of wars in American history. There, do you see that one? The War of 1812? Yeah. Let's talk about that one. What was it? For British school children, the War of 1812 is at best a footnote, a sideshow, overlooked by what we call the Napoleonic Wars. For Canadians, they learn about the war as, oh yeah, isn't that the time we burned down your White House, eh? And for us Americans, it is the most invisible of all of our major conflicts. This college humor movie trailer sums it up in a humorous way pretty well.
What happened during this time? Wikipedia had nothing!
It's funny. And yet, the War of 1812, the first time America declared war on a foreign nation, has much to teach us. In this video, we're going to talk about the causes, the sea battles, the land battles, and the effects, or lessons. So how did it all start? I've got 4 reasons for you in decreasing importance. You might remember what impressment means. The British illegally seized American merchant ships and forced their sailors to fight for Britain on British ships. And then there's the trade restrictions. Britain's Orders in Council laws required that American ships had to dock in the UK and pay a tax before they could trade with any other European country. What? Third, we Americans were encroaching on British, Spanish, and Indian territory out west, and we thought the British were helping the Indians, which they probably were. Last, we thought we could take Canada. We wanted that maple leaf. And when I say we, I don't mean all Americans. I mean the Warhawks. Not that kind of Warhawk. I mean these guys. Introducing John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, Henry Clay of Kentucky, and Felix Grundy of Tennessee. Felix Grundy sounds like a Harry Potter character, am I right? They made it sound like war was the only option. Even Thomas Jefferson echoed their war-hungry sentiments in thinking that taking Canada would be easy, a mere matter of marching. I like the alliteration, TJ, but come on, you know better. It should be noted, though, that in 1812, the size of Canada wasn't in its current almost 4 million square miles. It was more like this, so much smaller. In the end, the Warhawks won, but not by much. The very first congressional declaration of war came to a close vote, the closest in American history. And although the majority of Americans would be swept up by this movement to war, some Americans were not, most notably Virginia Congressman John Randolph. His loud and high-pitched voice warned his fellow representatives, "Gentlemen, you have made war. You have finished the ruin of our country. And before you conquer Canada, your idol," meaning Napoleon, "will cease to distract the world and the capital will be a ruin." Rather prophetic words. So let's start off with the first cause for war. Why were the British stealing our ships and supplies and our sailors in the first place? I mean, really, British impressment of American sailors wasn't about punishing America. It really had little to do with America at all. It was a part of a much bigger picture and conflict for the mighty British Empire. Let's get some clarity on that, shall we? Our reasons. What we were after were twofold. By 1812, we of the United Kingdom had been fighting revolutionary France for 19 years. We had to stop you Americans from trading with our hated French enemies, but we were also sorely lacking in supplies and money to wage this war with France around the world. Then here. What's more, we needed 140,000 sailors to man our ships, and since we didn't have enough crew, we stopped your ships and took nearly 10,000 of your men by force in our press gangs. Your fledgling nation could do little to stop us. We collected 40 times as much tax revenue as you Americans. By 1812, we had nearly 600 warships, while you had 16. See here. And By 1812, your president, James Madison, had signed an agreement with France's dictator, now emperor. Of course, I am talking of that Corsican upstart Napoleon. Your president had agreed with Napoleon that America would stop trading with Britain. That simply would not do. We would make you trade with us, even if we had to burn your capital to the ground to do it. So, it started as a maritime war, meaning a war at sea. This was the age of ship battles. Be prepared for a lot of cool ship names. The Phoebe versus the Essex. The Endymion versus the President. The Frolic versus the Wasp. The Peacock versus the Hornet. Feel free to come up with your own cool name for a warship. Go ahead. I've got time. Man, nothing stirs up patriotism like a naval victory. By the end of 1812, Captain Stephen Decatur's ship, the United States, successfully defeated the British man-of-war, the HMS Macedonian, near Spain's coast, and captured it, bringing it back to America. And the American ship and secret weapon, the USS Constitution, demolished and sank the British frigate Java off the coast of Brazil. Even our defeats were inspiring. When Captain James Lawrence was shot through the chest in the battle between the Shannon and the Chesapeake, his dying words, "Don't give up the ship," became the Navy's mantra. 3 months later, the ship named after him, the USS Lawrence, would be commanded by a young Lieutenant Oliver Hazard Perry in the 3-hour Battle of Put-in Bay, where his 9 ships captured the British fleet not in the ocean, but on Lake Erie. Perry's words also became famous. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." 3 days later, the British fleet bombarded an American defensive point on the Chesapeake called Fort McHenry. Despite shelling the fort throughout the night, British cannons could not get it to surrender. The American flag, tattered but still standing the next morning, is what inspired lawyer Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner, our country's anthem we still play to this day at sports events. I'm not gonna lie, the first battles were abject, humiliating defeats for America. General William Hull surrendered Detroit to British General Isaac Brock without firing a shot. At modern-day Chicago, the Americans surrendered the garrison at Fort Dearborn to the British, only to have Potawatomi Indians massacre all American men, women, and children. Likewise, the American attacks on Niagara and Montreal were disasters. Not until Lieutenant Perry took control of Lake Erie did America get some wins. So, in America, settlers had been moving into Indian lands in the Great Lakes area for years. This incursion brought about a war between a confederacy, or alliance, of Indian tribes under the impressive leadership of the Shawnee chieftain Tecumseh, and the troops led by American General William Henry Harrison, nicknamed Tippecanoe. Tecumseh's war actually got started in 1811, the year before the War of 1812 began. But now by 1813, it all came to a head when Harrison invaded Canada at the Battle of the Thames. Here, Harrison burned down some Canadian government buildings, something the British would later take their revenge for the next year. But most importantly, in this battle, the great chief Tecumseh was shot and killed, and with his death, most of the Indian resolve to support the British faded away. But our battlefield success was short-lived. By 1814, the British had defeated Napoleon. With that bigger war resolved, now they could afford to send more troops overseas, as in 30,000 expert veteran soldiers with the express purpose to defeat us uncivilized Americans. So this is when British Admiral George Cockburn and General Robert Ross march on Washington to burn it down as the American government runs away. The British walk into the nation's undefended capital. General Ross eats the meal laid out for the president in the White House and then proceeded to set it on fire, and the Capitol building and the Library of Congress and the Treasury on August 24th, 1814. Arguably America's darkest day. I mean, look at this. Admiral Cockburn is so proud of making our city burn, he has his portrait taken and he puts his act of arson in the background. This is also the day that President James Madison's wife, Dolly, grabs Gilbert Stuart's painting of George Washington and her pet parrot from the president's house before it gets torched. But before you start patting yourself on the back, Great Britain, this is also the day before the worst 2-hour tornado in Washington, D.C. history hits, tossing cannons in the air, uprooting trees, killing 2 British soldiers, and not 3 weeks later, the White House meal-munching General Ross is shot by a sniper as he unsuccessfully tries to attack Baltimore and dies. The British then set sail and combat American militias in Florida, at Pensacola, later at Mobile. They wanted to lure Americans away from Canada, but it should be pointed out that at this point, the UK was tired of the war with France, Napoleon, and now with their former colony. Public support for the war back in Britain was waning, and the people called for peace talks. So, in Belgium, in the city of Ghent, an unsatisfactory peace was reached on Christmas Eve. American diplomat John Quincy Adams signs it, which is one reason he will go on to become the 6th President of the United States 11 years later. But it took 3 weeks to get news of the peace treaty back to America, and in the meantime, there's one more big battle. And what a battle! No fight earned greater fame than the Battle of New Orleans, in which General Andrew Jackson and his Choctaw Indian allies defeated the British and their Creek Indian allies. Jackson lost something like 62 soldiers in that final battle, while the British suffered upwards of 2,034 casualties. I mean, the British kept throwing themselves uphill against Jackson's reinforced troops. It was a bloodbath. This battle is the biggest reason that Andrew Jackson will be America's war hero and will become the 7th President of the United States 14 years later. But why is the War of 1812, what the Warhawks called the Second War for Independence, important enough to learn about? I mean, what lessons does it hold for us today? For one, it put to rest certain misconceptions people had at the time. Like, you know who would never go to war with each other? Trading partners. Or freely elected governments. 2. From 1815 on, American-British relations got better and better. They've been our best allies for the last 200 years. What else? This war effectively killed off the Federalist Party, who had opposed the war from the start. The war lasted fewer than 1,000 days, but its effects have lasted centuries. It started the era of good feelings, and because of Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans, Spain sold us this cute little territory. Maybe you've heard of it? It's called Florida. It also meant freedom for thousands of black slaves who escaped to Canada. And speaking of our neighbor to the north, the war united Canada, bringing together divided groups to fend off the American attacks so that 50 years later, Canada unified to become a dominion. And we can't forget, this was the war that broke the power of the strongest Indian alliance of its time. Native peoples were the real losers of this war. Tecumseh's tribes would be driven out of the Great Lakes area as more Americans would settle there. And this war also carries a warning for us today. Before you follow the voices that demand we go to war, know the cost. But the all-important question, did we win the war? Depends. The UK and the US both claimed victory, and maybe both were right, because both defined success in a different way. The reason the War of 1812 has been so forgettable is because it changed little. Ultimately, we didn't beat up the British in this war. I mean, if anything, the UK had more victories. They burned down our capital. We didn't take Canada. The British Army was still the mightiest in the world. And the Treaty of Ghent that officially ended the war didn't promise any advantages or improvements for us or Great Britain. The treaty brought relations back to status quo ante bellum, or the status before the war, with one exception. Britain didn't conquer us again. So you'll excuse us if America felt like we had won. And more than that, this is the war that convinced America that we are a big player on the world stage and will grow to be a mighty nation. And so we have.